Hello again, everyone. Welcome to the Adult Sunday School lesson for February the 8th, 2026. It's an Old Testament lesson from the book of Genesis entitled Cain and Abel. This is the beginning of the Unit 2 in our study guide for the month of February, which is entitled Tales of Crime and Punishment. These stories from Genesis highlight the human predicament, one of human failure at the disobedience to God. That was last week's lesson with Adam and Eve. Today it's sin committed against another person, Cain and Abel. Next week it's sin so great that God destroys the world. This is the flood of Noah. These lessons draw a progressive human degradation into depth and darkness, requiring a redeemer. There are powerful reminders in the 3 Sundays before the beginning of Lent. You can see this lesson is only 3 weeks in duration, and it precedes the start of Lent. We're currently in the season of Epiphany. And of course, Epiphany celebrates the visit of the Magi and runs from January the 6th to Ash Wednesday, the beginning of Lent. There's a whole series of weeks involved, weeks and months. In fact, Lent, the season of Lent this year, will start on February 18th. That's why there's only 3 lessons in this unit. And Lent then will conclude on Monday, Thursday, April the 2nd this year, right before Good Friday and Easter Sunday. Here's a picture of Reverend Jane Davis, who is the minister of spiritual formation at First Baptist Church, Wilmington, North Carolina. She's the author of our lessons in this unit. These early chapters of Genesis, everybody has an understanding of it. Not everybody sees them the same way. I see them as theology, not necessarily science. They were written at a time that was pre-scientific. They are presented in such a way that no matter what aspect of science you agree with, you can find relevance and meaning and truth in these stories. So I can't possibly go over in a 30-minute lesson all the different ways to look at these stories, but I have my way, and so that's what I'm going to be presenting today. I take the Genesis stories as theology and not as history, science, or literal fact, scientific fact. That's not to say that they're untrue, it's just that they're not presented as scientific fact. At least that's my understanding of it. I don't quibble with others who have a different understanding, but this is my point of departure and the way I will be presented in these lessons. Genesis is the first book in the Bible, the first book in what's called the Law, often called the Pentateuch. You can see the prefix penta, meaning 5. These first 5 books in the Hebrew scriptures are significant, and they're said to be the law of Moses. The Jewish scripture is divided into 3 parts. The law, which we are looking at today, which most observers consider to be the most important part of the Hebrew scriptures. Next come the prophets. They, in the Hebrew way of organizing the scriptures, the prophets include not only the major and the minor prophets, but also what we Christians call the historical books, Samuel, Kings, etc., Chronicles, etc. They call them former prophets and latter prophets. And then the third division of the Hebrew scriptures is called the writings, which includes Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and other writings. Christians, however, believe that the teachings in these texts have been updated by Jesus. So they're true in large measure, but they're not the final word because we have updates in the New Testament and particularly from the teachings of Jesus. One particular aspect of this is, according to the importance of the Hebrew priests, the high point of creation was not the creation of man, but rather the creation of Sabbath. And of course, Jesus said that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. So, though these Hebrew scriptures are important, they're not the final word. Genesis in its present form came together from 4 identifiable source documents. Some writers of these documents call God Jehovah, and so Jehovah beginning with a J, we use a shorthand letter J to describe this document which we find in these writings. Other writers call God Elohim, beginning with an E. So for abbreviation, we'll say E pertains to these writers who have a different take on some of the occurrences. Some texts come from the Jewish law found in Deuteronomy, which we abbreviate as D, where we'll not be dealing with that source document in our study because we're in the early chapters of Genesis and not in the book of Deuteronomy. And some texts were written during or after the exile by priests, abbreviated as P. Our text last week, dealing with Adam and Eve, for example, comes from this priestly document. However, today's documents come from the Jehovah or the J source document. It's obvious that Moses could not have written all of these texts, though he could have edited some or passed along some of the stories orally. Here's a graphic that shows that the P priestly code was one of the latter components of the book of Genesis, but the account of Adam and Eve comes from this priestly writing. Chapters 2, 3, 4, really up until we get to chapter 11 or so, comes from the J source document. But once we start dealing with Abraham and his descendants, then we have a mix of the J document and the E document. We're going to see today that there's also an early poetic fragment in chapter 4, which doesn't come from either of these sources, but is an important text because it lays the context for what comes later. So I will be mentioning that. Genesis chapters 1 through 11 contain 4 prehistorical, what some call parables of creation. Some people take them as literal fact about how things went. Others see them more as parables of creation, and that's my point of view. It's not the only one, but you need to join the Sunday school class so you could get other points of view as well. It seems to me that the story of Adam and Eve deals with God's justice in the world, exemplified by Sabbath. All creatures get rest on the Sabbath. The responsibility for human morality was last week's topic, dealing with Adam and Eve and the fall from the garden, or expulsion from the garden. Some people see this as humanity progressing from creatures that behave by instinct alone to creatures that now behave due to ethics and morality. We have to make choices. And so that may be some of the parable from last week in Adam and Eve. Today we have the tragedy of human violence entering into the world by Cain slaying Abel, brother killing brother. That's another of the parables in these early chapters of Genesis. And then we have the divine punishment of human evil by the universal flood, which we will look at next week. These 4 great historical parables of creation then set the stage for the coming of Abraham, which is more of a historic presentation rather than a parable. At least that's how I see it. Today we're looking at brother killing brother. It's a fact in the animal world that carnivores do not generally kill members of their own kind. It's only humans who do this. Other animals who live by instinct don't kill their own kind. But humans have no instinct against killing members of our own species. In fact, a brother will kill a brother, as we will see in Genesis chapter 4. But instead of instinct, we have only morality. And that was the great lesson of Genesis 2:3 last week with the fall, or some people would say with the coming of morality and culture into the world. We no longer are behaving as animals would, which have an aversion, will not kill one another. But with the coming of ethics and morality, our enlightenment, our expulsion from the garden, humans have been capable of killing one another. And that's what we're dealing with today. So it's morality, the difference between right and wrong, not instinct, that stands between us and extinction. That's how I see it. Dr. Francisco, who I like to quote, says that the Bible contains both prose and poetry that must be interpreted with imagination and not literally. Just because a passage is figurative does not mean it's not true. For example, Dr. Francisco says, Jesus asked his disciples to eat his flesh and drink his blood. He did not mean to be taken literally, but rather to be taken seriously. So I do take these early chapters of Genesis seriously. I do not take them, however, literally. Let us look at these 16 verses. Normally in this study guide we have fewer verses to contend with, but we have 16 verses today. This is really a lot of reading. So I encourage you to turn on the closed caption feature of YouTube so that you can see the words as I pronounce them, because I am likely to make a mistake or not see them correctly and may stumble a bit. So I urge you to read along as I read. Now the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord. Next, she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel, for his part, brought of the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. The Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. Cain said to his brother Abel, Let us go out to the field. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is your brother Abel? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now You are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me. Then the Lord said to him, not so. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, so that no one who came around him would kill him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Wow, what a series of events. In verse 1, we see that the first event after humans are expelled from Eden is the birth of Adam, the birth to Adam and Eve of two sons, Cain and Abel. And it said in verse 2 that Abel was a keeper of sheep. Some people might call that a rancher. And Cain, a tiller of the ground or a farmer. Verse 8 says that Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. This is the first fratricide. When you kill a brother, it's called fratricide. This is the first murder in the Bible. As I mentioned before, animals behaving through instinct will not kill members of their own species. But we're different now that we have this internal Spirit of God or internal system of ethics or morality that has superseded our instinct, then we're liable to do many hurtful things, including kill people. That humans will do so, that is, kill our own species, is the consequence of acquiring the ability to know good and evil. Here's a picture of Cain and Abel. Evidently, they were different in many respects. They offered different sacrifices. Some commentators make a great deal about the difference in character of the sacrifices. That is, Abel's blood sacrifice was somehow better than the grain sacrifice of Cain. But it seems to me that that's not the primary issue. The primary issue is the spirit with which we make the offering or sacrifice. And clearly the scripture says that Cain was, his mind was not in a good frame of, in a good place. He was angry and doing wrong. And of course, when we do that, our offerings or sacrifice to the Lord will not be potent. This murdering of a shepherd by a farmer in his own farm, on his own farm, this is farmer displacing the shepherd, is not punished in kind by God, which I think is somewhat strange. There's no revenge, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. God does not kill Cain in punishment for killing Abel. In fact, God only marks Cain as a warning to others not to harm him. So it seems that God is giving Cain a measure of grace and not condemnation or punishment that he deserved. I think there's a great lesson here that many times we do not receive the punishment we have coming to us, and we should be grateful for the grace that forestalls God's hand of vengeance against us for the things that we do. Again, I note there's no counter-violence by God, not even appropriate divine vengeance when Abel's blood cries out to God from the ground. Graphic way of saying that this was a very bad situation. Cain has no instinct about killing his brother Abel, which is a sad commentary on the actions that we can partake of when we're guided only by our internal sense of ethics or morality. Some commentators draw attention to the offerings made by Cain and Abel, implying that the animal sacrifice of Abel is more pleasing to God than Cain's grain offering. As I mentioned before, I don't think that's the main reason for it. Others see this story as a parable of the triumph of settlements over nomads. And, the herders and ranchers, those who had flocks, wander around, and that would be what Abel's livelihood was, whereas Cain was a city dweller or a settlement dweller. And many see this in the history of the world, that the nomads and the ranchers and herders have always been displaced when cities arise. For example, as a young boy, we had our house taken by eminent domain so they could build an expressway. So, you can't stand in the way of progress, and some see this as the beginning of how settlement and city and dwellings take priority over any other consideration. But within the context of these early chapters of Genesis, I see this as setting the stage for the great increase in violence among humans, leading to God's cosmic cleanup with the universal flood in Noah. This is the Cain slaying Abel is the first instance of violence among people that quickly escalates. Notice in verse 14, in which God declares that anyone killing Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance. Not in our focal text, but just a few verses from this, we see a famous piece of scripture. This person, Lamech, or Lamesh, I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce it, proclaims, "I have killed a man for wounding me." If Cain is avenged sevenfold, surely Lamech, or myself, will be avenged 77-fold. So can you imagine that? We go from one dead to 7 dead, and now with Lamech, 77-fold. So you can see there's a sharp increase or exponential growth in killing that is depicted in these early chapters. The farmer kills the herder, builds a city, and human violence escalates exponentially. Unfortunately, that's the world we live in now. This sets the stage for God's initial solution to the problem of human violence. I say initial because Noah and the great flood did wipe out everybody except one family, but that wasn't God's final word on that. We have the solution to the problem of evil through Abraham, and that begins in Genesis chapter 11 and 12. More on that next week. What is this mark of Cain that God put on Cain to protect him? It was an instance of grace, as I see it. It wasn't a punishment, but it was to help him live and not be killed outright. It's a sign ordained by God to protect Cain from being killed by others after he had murdered his brother Abel. It's perhaps a paradoxical symbol of divine protection and mercy, warning that anyone who kills Cain will suffer sevenfold vengeance. The Bible does not define exactly what this physical nature of this mark is, which has led to various speculative interpretations. The most prominent one in my experience is that it's some mark on his forehead or some prominent tattoo, we might call it, that would indicate this is Cain and not to be harmed. But others speculate that it could be darkening of skin or some other impediment, some way to identify this person as standing out from all other creatures. But we do have this escalating human violence that begins with this. Cain slays his brother Abel, one death. Whoever kills Cain will have a vengeance of 7 deaths, as depicted in our text today. Whoever kills Lamech will encounter 77 deaths. And notice with Lamech, he didn't kill somebody. He killed somebody just for bruising him or wounding him. Like in the Wild West, if you step on my toe, I'm going to shoot you down like a dog. This is violence on top of violence, not in proportion to what's received. It's what's needful here is when we get to eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, at least that's measured violence. But what's being described here is violence out of control, runaway violence. And of course, we'll see next week with the great flood, perhaps thousands were killed, and all living creatures with the exception of one family, and 2 each of the animals, or a few of the animals, survived that great flood. But then there's God's second solution to the problem of evil. That's the Abraham solution, which starts in Genesis 12. So that's good. But human violence continues its exponential increase. I'm a student of World War II. Being in the Army for a few years, I have fathers and grandfathers who participated in World War II. And when I talk about it to classes, many people have no idea how many people actually were casualties of World War II, but it's over 82 million that we know of. It may even be 100 million people just in a few years of war. Most people don't understand or don't know, for example, that the most people who were killed were Chinese, killed by Chinese civilians, killed by Japanese soldiers, about 35 million. Then there's about 25 Russian civilians killed by German soldiers. Huge numbers. The United States lost around 450,000 deaths in World War II, which is a lot, but that was less than 0.5% of all the people killed in World War II. So left on our own to be guided only by our internal sense of ethics and morality, we kill each other. It's a terrible problem. God somehow must intervene. That's why we have the apocalypse and the hopeful returning of the Lord, because we as a species are not capable of behaving with one another. So who is this Lamech? He's a descendant of Cain. He boasts to his wives about killing a man for wounding him. He declares if Cain is avenged 7-fold, Lamech himself would be avenged 77-fold. This highlights an extreme escalation of violence and human self-importance. This scripture, I wanted to mention it even though it's not in our focal passage, is important because it signifies a shift from God's original protection of Cain to an arrogant human vengeance run rampant in the world. It displays a runaway violence requiring God's intervention, which we will see next week in the flood. So, here's our man, Lamech. This is also an interesting portion of Scripture because this poetic fragment is not from any of the 4 source documents that I mentioned earlier, but is an independent strand or story that has been fitted into this narrative. What about us? Well, these are questions that I think are quite significant. I have my answer for. I'm not going to share it here because it's no better than anyone else's answer. But what is the correct response when we feel life isn't fair? Cain may have felt that. He may have been jealous of what Abel was able to present. But, many people will lash out in anger when we feel we're at the short end of the stick and life isn't fair. What is the right way? How do we respond in situations like that? What a wonderful discussion question for Sunday school. What mark of guilt do we sense in ourselves that could also be understood as a sign of grace? This is an important question. In the dating realm, for example, when maybe our hearts have been broken by someone that we wanted to date or have experience with, but they did not want us, and they said no to us. Well, I've been to counselors who say sometimes no is God's protection. And so, in this sense, being shielded from problems, shielded from hurt the way God attempted to shield Cain by this mark is helpful to us. So, on the short term, we might feel hurt, but in the long term, it might be ultimate protection. And where has sin left us restless and rootless, like Cain? Could no longer till the ground. He had to go and find his livelihood in a city somewhere. So many times there are consequences to the problems and sin and mistakes we make that spill over into our life, requiring us to find new solutions. So I encourage you to join a Sunday school class to hear other answers and to share your own answer to these questions, which come about through this early parable of sin and violence in the world. So, join this class or discussion group, add your input. Classes are available here at First Baptist Middletown for every age group, and there's room for you. We would benefit from you being here. Thank you for joining me today. Again, don't take me too seriously. I have no seminary degree. I'm just a layperson with a point of view. The disclaimer I make is that this lesson makes fair use of copyrighted materials that I've come across, including this quarterly or this study guide and other materials. But it's for education purposes only. There's no commercial intent. Do remember our prayer concerns, and I hope to see you next week when we look at God's first solution to the problem of evil in the world. Thank you, Daryl Elster, our Minister of Education and Technology, for producing, directing, recording, troubleshooting, and loading these lessons onto YouTube. Until next week, I'll say goodbye.